Well, hello, and thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. I have a very, very special pleasure today to get the opportunity to talk to Dr. Kent Redford. Hello, Mr. Redford. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
You have a very exciting career behind you. Would you mind to introduce yourself real quick?
Of course, certainly. I was trained as an ecologist. I did my field work in Brazil on giant anteaters. And from there, I went to the University of Florida, where I was on the faculty for 10 years and with colleagues set up 2 interdisciplinary graduate training programs that focused on bringing master's and PhD students from tropical countries to Florida and give them their degrees. After that period in academia, I decided that I needed to change and moved into the non-governmental organization world. First with 5 years at the Nature Conservancy, where I was in charge of the Parks in Peril program, which was a large USAID-funded program that worked in protected areas in Latin America. And after that time in the Nature Conservancy, I moved to the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is based in the Bronx Zoo in New York, and spent 14 years there doing a lot of work on science-related issues and the interface between science and implementation, both in the 61 field programs where WCS works, as well as in the 4 New York City zoos and aquarium. After that time period, I wanted to try something on my own and moved. My wife and I moved to Portland, Maine, which is where I now live, and I established a small firm called Archipelago Consulting, which works to help improve the practice of conservation by individuals, companies, and organizations. And so I've been doing a variety of things since then. But part of that has been, I think, the topic of our conversation, which is that I spent almost 10 years working on the intersection between conservation and synthetic biology.
That's exactly right. And in order for my studies, I came across this amazing book, Strange Natures, Conservation in the Era of Synthetic Biology. As part of my podcast, which is that the last question is always the first question for the next guest. Last, I had on my former art professor, and he said, well, just ask the next person what they think when they see this image, which will be this one. Hope you can see it a little bit.
It looks like a horse that's been in some sort of a restraint on its back.
Right. People can put it like that as well, and then they say it looks a bit like Pegasus.
No. It looks like a very uncomfortable animal.
Yeah, well, it's a racehorse that they did operations on. My brother used to be photographer at the animal hospital in Zurich, and he took that picture. Do you have any thoughts on animal hospitals?
Thoughts on that? Well, I think it's an extremely important practice, and I myself have benefited through problems that we've had over the years with pets that have been solved by people trained in the veterinary sciences. And then when I was doing my dissertation work, I was based at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., and was friends with some of the vets there. And then again, the WCS has a very large and active veterinary program at the New York City Zoo. So I have had a real appreciation for much of the work that's being done. I have a colleague now, an Austrian, who is head of the animal health program, the field vet program, I think it used to be called at WCS, named Chris Valser. And so I have tremendous admiration for those people, yes.
Yeah, that is. I find it interesting too, because I happened to talk to Alex Rubel, who used to be the director of Zoo Zurich and an old friend of my dad's. So in zoos, they have veterinarians that are looking for that the animals get well fed, and then they have zoologists. I read in your book, for example, that zoos take on roles for conservation. Would you like to maybe explain what conservation means in terms of a zoo?
Sure. There are a variety of different dimensions to zoo-based conservation, and it's important to point out that zoos and botanic gardens, which is really the plant equivalent, were part of the formation of the field of conservation biology. And they have not had as important a rise in the general public's view, except for the fact that millions of people go to zoos every year. And their experience with the animals and what they learn while they're there, what they're taught in the course of the zoo visit, can have very important implications for the long-term conservation of animals and ecosystems. So if we're talking about good zoos, and by good I mean certified, where there's proper care of animals, which is not true in every place where animals are kept. But in good zoos, there is an important dimension to educate visitors about the conservation status and about what the visitors can do, as well as work on contributing towards the long-term conservation of particular species, usually through breeding programs, which are between zoos where animals are moved back and forth in order to breed and maintain genetic diversity. Zoos have been the source of a whole variety of animals that have been returned to the wild and that have been maintained through these coordinated breeding programs, so that the genetics is good in terms of being able to release the animals back to their natural environment.
I read in your book, which I haven't heard before, about a frozen zoo at San Diego Zoo. What would be the role of that? Or can you explain a bit about this?
Certainly, of course. So it's easiest to start with Svalbard's seed bank. So people understand fully why we should keep the seeds of plants safe, so that if anything should happen to the plants in the wild, that we could regrow those plants from these saved seed. It's in fact what farmers do at the end of the growing season, is saving seed. There is the equivalent for animals, which it's not as common, but in San Diego and other places, there are large cryogenic freezers, extremely cold, where the germplasm of a variety of different animals is kept. And that germplasm can then be used for further study and perhaps eventually for active conservation work at a later time, should that be needed. There are some exciting examples very recently of how tissue from the frozen zoo has been used in conservation programs. But if you think about it as an analog to the seed saving, that's, I think, would be the best way to try to understand it.
Mm-hmm. So as an aspiring bioethicist, I will have to ask this question to you. Would you agree that nature will take over when humans get extinct at some point, unless there was an Earth explosion?
Oh, no, that's completely right. And I think that that's very important to understand that if humans went extinct, most of the natural world would be much better off. Thank you very much.
Which then, yeah, exactly, raises the question, why is conservation important? Is it of us being egoistical because we know that biodiversity is also crucial for our survival? Or is it still ethics and we know it's the right thing to do because we know the influence of the human on the planet? So that would be an ethical reason why we should do conservation. What is your view on that?
I hold both those positions. That there is a lot of biodiversity, not all of it, but a lot of it, which is necessary to allow humans to continue to grow and flourish. as humans. Then there is that ethical responsibility that we humans have been responsible directly or indirectly for the extinction of a large number of species, with many more queued up to go that way. And so conservation is making an effort both to try to maintain healthy environments for people, but also to try to ensure that humans are not responsible for any more extinctions, if at all possible.
Yeah, right. And methods. And
Right.
Talking of methods, which is what your book is mainly about, is synthetic biology. I don't want to explain too long what synthetic biology is, because I assume that the audience that will watch that has a certain understanding already. But would you mind to maybe just say something that might be surprising for somebody that is already a little bit familiar with synthetic biology?
So it's a collective term for a variety of tools for making very precise changes to the level of genes, the genetic components. And so in terms of surprising, I think most people haven't thought about the fact that the changes that are being made are to deliver things that humans want. So it is engineering in that sense. And even if what the humans want is for the animal or plant to survive on its own, that's still a human intent. And certainly for the applications in agriculture and human medicine, it's even more so, clearly. So you have to define why it is you're doing what you're doing in order to do it. And that, I think, is not firmly understood by at least many of the lay people who are introduced to the topic.
Right, but it kind of grew out in biology or even biophysics or biochemistry from macromolecular biology, so to speak, right? So where does it differ from micromolecular biology?
Sure, I think your question raises an important point. The engineers have taken over biology. That's what's going on. So it's not one kind of biology intruding into another form of biology. It really is engineering. So it's a famous, one of the early originators of the field of synthetic biology named Knight, who said, evolution is 3.5 billion years old. It's time for a reboot. So there is the sense that engineers think that biology is inefficient and that it is too slow and too laborious and can't do everything that humans want biology to do, and that if we would only let the engineers in at biology, that they could make it better. And so that's, I think, the dominant new field. The biologists, certainly in the conservation world, are aghast at the fact that engineers and engineering is what is really moving very aggressively into the field of biology with an engineering perspective on it. Where what was evolved over billions of years is no longer sacred. If it's not useful, then let's cut it out and put it in the trash can and put in something that'll work better. And that's a very different worldview. And whether or not you're a religious person or a secular person, there is a sense that there is, on the part of the engineers, a lack of reverence, and I use that term advisedly, for life. It's been turned into a machine with parts that can be swapped in and out. And that's exactly what's happening.
It is, but it's still so enormously complicated, as you highlighted in your book. Where do you think, how much of it are we missing out on information that we don't know and still jumping into this new endeavor of synthetic biology?
Right. We don't know a lot. On the other hand, it's unclear that all of the genes and all of the function within a genome is in fact necessary for that organism. There's an article that was just published in November, so just now, about a project in a New York university where the investigators have taken 50% of the genome of a yeast and replaced it with synthetic DNA. And their objective is to be able to synthesize 100%. So they think that they can understand a living organism to the extent that they can synthesize it. And they're certainly well on the way towards doing that. And by the way, while they're doing that 50%, they added a new and completely unprogrammed gene into that. So there's a lot of work being done that at least suggests that for microorganisms in yeast, bacteria, and viruses, that it is possible to do some of this sort of work. And it's being done, it has been being done, and is being done in commercially significant ways by companies now.
When I read your book, I saw there was a lot of humor or almost sarcastic about the examples that you make, which made me laugh, but, also with a crying eye, so to speak, because it's not always that funny, but like, it's funny because it's true and it is true. And I think you get a bit more serious towards the end of the book and almost a bit pessimistic. Like, do you see more risks or also great benefits of synthetic biology just in general?
Well, I'm glad you found some parts mildly humorous. My co-author, Bill Adams, from Cambridge, has got one of the best Brit senses of humor I have ever run across. And he makes me laugh like nobody's business. So as we were working together, there were times when we had to include a bit of it. Am I pessimistic? The book has not sold well. And I think, and in fact, the literary agent who worked with us to get it published said, you're not going to get a lot of readers for this book because it's neither wildly enthusiastic about the technology, will save the world, nor is it deeply pessimistic about the technology. We're all going to rack and ruin with this. Because you wrote a book that demands that the readers think and make up their own minds, it's not going to get reviewed because people want to be told that the authors have a very strong editorial position. And our editorial position is each person needs to make up his or her own mind about this. And what we want, my objective in writing the book was so that people would not be able to say, how come nobody ever told me about this? Which is why I got engaged in trying to look at the intersection between synthetic biology and conservation, because my conservation colleagues never had heard of this field and didn't know why they should care about it. And the idea was I didn't want my colleagues to say, nobody ever told me. So at least I could say, Bill and I told you. Now, if you chose not to think about it, that's your own choice. But information is available. And there has been a rise in a broader conservation concern, interest in this. So I think to that extent, we contributed, but not responsible. Mm-hmm. We contributed to doing that.
Well, that question also comes with a compliment, because sometimes I really didn't know where you stand or personally towards the examples that you give, which shows that you're very objective with your analysis. You don't force the reader to make up their mind of ideas that you brought up. Was that also in your objective, to be objective?
Oh, absolutely. And I'll compliment back to you for having done wanting to do the work to form your own opinion. But I will say that the book is regarded as anti-technology by technologists and pro-technology by anti-technologists, because in this polarized world, if you don't strongly state that you're for something, then people will say you're against it. And if you don't strongly say you're against it, they say you're for it. So we actually have been criticized for holding positions that are polar opposite from one another. And I think that's okay, because then that leaves a young, smart person like yourself to have to pick your way through it and make up your own mind. And hopefully by making up your own mind, it'll be a more informed position.
Absolutely. And that's where the book is really great. It kind of brings me to something I saw as well. I think it is IUCS.
International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Yes, IUCN.
It's been a while when I saw that, like meetings that you had, and then it was a kind of, I don't know, I don't want to be negative. I don't like to be negative. It was almost like hijacked. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, is the largest sort of environmental group in the world. It has 1,300 members who are organizations or governments. So it represents many governments, but also a large number of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, as well as indigenous and local people organizations. And so they meet every 4 years and pass or review a set of resolutions which make up their work program for the 4 years. So 4 years before this meeting, which was in France, in Marseille, the membership said, we want IUCN to put together a working group to evaluate the possibility of forming a policy on the intersection between synthetic biology and conservation. I was asked to put together that group. I did so. We worked over the space of 5 or 6 years, put out a large review of the science, and then drafted language for a policy, which was going to be voted on by the members of the IUCN. The groups who were strongly against any use of synthetic biology, in fact, they would like a global moratorium. Members of those organizations, which were not members of IUCN, got themselves included in delegations specifically in order to torpedo our proposed policy language. And they were extremely effective political actors and got the membership to reject the policy proposal that we had put forward over the course of this 5, 6 years of work. And the membership decided instead that they wanted to have another group to spend 4 more years to take on the same assignment that we had had. So what? So that means that, if you shrink around and just look at our process, it didn't succeed because what we had come up with was rejected. On the other hand, if you take a longer point of view perspective, you would say that we had succeeded because we had tilled the ground and done a lot of the heavy work to get the organization to be interested in enough that it wanted to go have a second run at this. So they're in the course of doing that. And I told the senior people I was working with that I didn't want to be involved in the second round. I had had my go, but also in the course of that, I became a poisonous figure for this effort. And if there was any chance of it succeeding, I needed to separate myself from it. So I'm not involved in the second round.
Okay. Well, that's the journalism minor that wouldn't study me, which I have to ask, how does that make you feel?
Sure. Oh, I felt really angry at the time. But it being Marseille, I was taken out to a very nice meal, delicious French food and wine, and some sage advice by people who had been doing this much longer than I, that in fact this was a success, although I didn't feel that it was. And I mean, by raising this and getting all the publicity, that was the point. And by drawing out people who felt so strongly against it, there were a broader number of people who got to hear that perspective. Mm-hmm. And that's good. And so, so we'll see what goes on. I myself don't think that I have much of an active role in this next round, IUCN or not. We've written the book, we've done this process. So I'm relocating myself into a sort of a related but different issue, and wish Godspeed to those who are running this next round of it.
Okay, but the anger doesn't sting so much anymore at this point. You got found a bit peace in it, or is it still like bugging you? Or maybe another question: what would you do differently today, knowing what happened back then?
So IUCN has I think, has a systemic problem, which is that it has no immune system. So once you can get inside, as these people did by becoming false members, you can have your way, just as a virus can have with human when it avoids the human immune system. So there's that. The second thing, and what I offered up as a suggestion for the next round to IUCN, was to adopt an approach that has been developed called citizenship councils, which is to educate citizens about new technologies and let them make up their mind. And I suggested that if IUCN thought of itself as having 1,300 citizens, that they could proceed in that way, and they are going to. I don't know exactly how that's working, but they're taking an entirely different approach towards trying to develop this language, and I think that's great, and it'll be interesting to see how that works out.
Do you think even the opponents of, let's say, where your stance is, have some valid points that? So it's not just like hijacking as a parasite, but there is actually some value to what they bring in as well.
And you used the right word, value. So in my opinion, there is a fight that is pretending to be about science that is actually about values. And the major position the way that I characterize the position held by many of the people who are entirely against any applications of synthetic biology in the natural world, is that they don't think humans have any business changing what nature has developed at the genetic level. And that's a value position. And of course it has value because it's a value. And so it should be understood and interrogated and discussed and pushed around. And what we offered as part of the argument in the book, and to me it's an important realization, is that there was really about 20 years ago a major debate within conservation about wilderness. And wilderness was considered to be places where humans, at that time called man, had no impact. And so we needed to conserve wilderness because it was places where we could look at what the world would look like without human impact. And then along came a set of very well-reasoned and well-read and well-articulated people, one of whom, Gary Nabhan, was a writer, and I'm a big fan of his. He said the conservation community, or the conservationists, had to create wilderness in order to save it. And they created it by expelling local and traditional peoples from areas and then claiming that as wilderness. So I think, or the argument we make, is that there is a replication of this same issue, the same wilderness debate, only this time it's not focused on ecosystems, but it's focused on genomes. And that this value-based position says that there is something special and unique and super valuable about genomes that does not reflect human intervention. And therefore, we should not countenance any human intervention, because then we will have lost this special, sacred, natural thing. That, I think, is the argument. It's a recapitulation of the same thing. And I think that the science is already pretty clear that many genomes already show the impact of human influence, just as with ecosystems. That can then become a separate conversation, but that's my understanding, and I think it's a very valid and valuable position that should be heard, should be articulated, and then should be interrogated.
So in a way, would you say a lot of the issues sometimes also have to do with semantics? The way people define things and then, extract a problem out of something that is for somebody else with a different definition. I mean, let's talk about maybe what is nature, what is artificial. You wrote that beautifully, that, some may say nature is what is born and artificial is what's been made, right? Like But it's these little terms that sometimes make a huge impact. And, we're just talking about clarifying definitions. What's your stand on that?
I used to believe 10 or 15 years ago, 10 or 20 years ago, that it was about semantics. And then I got introduced to behavioral economics and politics. And then, in the US, with the rise of Donald Trump and people who supported him and the rhetoric associated with that and the impact of that on the acceptance or rejection of vaccines for the COVID-19, that it isn't all about semantics, that semantics are received on fertile ground, which has been made fertile by values. And so I now think that you have to start with the values part and then do this semantics part, because we could agree on definitions and still completely disagree on management actions.
I mean, if you talk about the vaccine issue, isn't it kind of similar to what you're talking about? When people get confronted, and we getting confronted with synthetic biology, we're like, don't know exactly, when we open that box, or as you said, the genie out of a bottle, like it's maybe hard to put them in. So somehow then it's still, not maybe wrong to at least understand that other people question that, right?
Oh, of course. I mean, I don't think anybody should accept anything without questioning it, at least once you've left the house of your parents. Yeah. Sure, I'm all in favor of people interrogating everything, particularly important topics like this. And the book was really an invitation for asking people to interrogate the topic themselves. And
it actually brings me, it brings me actually to a more important question, I think, which is, do you think the vocabulary today is more accessible, like interdisciplinary? For example, a virologist knows already more about physics because there is more readily available the information and not behind closed classrooms.
So I think that's true, but I also think that everybody has become an expert in everything. So, you get on the internet, and if you don't like what somebody says, you can write a blog, you can write a critical posting. And so there's been a devaluing of expertise. And so the democratization, in a sense, of language has given rise to a degradation of science. So it used to be when I started out, people said, "Oh, you had a PhD in biology," and then there would be some sort of belief that what I had to say about biology after that had some weight to it. And I don't think that's true anymore. People say, "Well, I just don't agree with that," or "You're a communist," or "You're gay," or whatever it is, to dismiss what I have to say because they don't agree with it. And I'm not, I don't have anything original to say on this, but people who think about it a lot are very concerned about our ability to have civil disagreements and then collective decision making. But that's the only way we can move forward, particularly in this conservation setting.
Right. I mean, again, coming from more the philosophical part and bioethics, I think it's a big problem because there you do have to, get into opinions. And I think it can be very difficult for a bioethicist to actually understand what happens in those chemistry labs and field studies, because it's a craft and you have to explain what happens in the craft, which I find extremely challenging. And I know you are not, it's not like you're not trained like a bioethicist, but I think the way you wrote has like really good ground on such a job. But then again, you know what the matter is. Do you think that ethicists in a way can still take on that role of better education and better understanding and ethical considerations?
Yes, I think it's vital. And I don't think you have to understand all the science. I think doctors send patients to get brain scans, and they don't know all the electrical engineering that goes into making the machine that's provides it, but they know how to interpret what it says. And so I think we have to suspend the desire to understand everything to be able to have an opinion in this ever more complicated world. But I do think that the ethical position, an educated ethical position, is absolutely essential. And probably we need even more of it than less of it. So you need to hurry up and finish your studies and get out there and take some of these things.
Sounds good. That's almost a nice word to finish on. But at least I would like you to formulate a question for my next guest, who I don't know who it is. Something that interests you or you think is interesting to ask.
Here's this. So natural used to be contrasted not with artificial, but with supernatural. So supernatural is something that the gods did. So my question to your next guest is whether there is any place in the world for supernatural, considering the supernatural.
That is such a great question. So I would say really thank you so much. The message is very important. I hope a lot of people get educated on these subjects, conservation, also what's going on in biology, synthetic biology. It's complicated stuff, but with a little bit of reading and interest. And again, I really do want to recommend this book for such a read. I think that's a very healthy thing to do. So again, thank you, Dr. Redford, so much.
And I enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate you calling. Thank you.
Thanks. Me too. Thank you. Bye.